A former Formula One team principal just said something about Lewis Hamilton that has absolutely nothing to do with lap times, pit stops, or championship points, and yet it has somehow become one of the most talked about stories in the entire paddock this week, because he did not criticize Hamilton's driving, he did not question his contract, he went straight after something far more personal: the clothes Hamilton wears when he walks into the paddock, and the reaction online has been so massive, so divided, so genuinely explosive, that even people who have never watched a single Formula One race are suddenly weighing in. So stick with me for the next few minutes, because this story is not just about fashion, it connects directly to Hamilton's difficult season with Ferrari, his complicated public image right now, and a much bigger conversation about what fans actually expect from their sporting heroes. So let's start with exactly what happened, because this all began on the High Performance Racing podcast, hosted by Jake Humphrey, when former Alpine and Aston Martin team boss Otmar Szafnauer sat down for a discussion about which drivers on the grid arrive earliest to the circuit on a race weekend. And when Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton came up in that conversation, Szafnauer decided to take a very specific, very pointed shot at Hamilton's habits, suggesting that Hamilton deliberately times his arrival at the track for maximum attention, saying, quote, "He can wear the ridiculous clothing and take pictures," a line that instantly shifted the entire tone of the conversation, because Jake Humphrey, sitting right across from him, immediately pushed back, defending Hamilton's fashion sense and describing it as simply, quote, "out there," to which Szafnauer, clearly unconvinced, shot back with a sharp, almost dismissive question, asking plainly, "And that's not ridiculous?" And for a moment, it genuinely felt like this was going to be a full-blown, uncomfortable takedown of one of the most successful athletes in the history of the sport. But then something interesting happened, because as the conversation continued, Szafnauer's tone actually softened, and he admitted something that changes how you should interpret this entire exchange, saying about Hamilton's ability to wear bold, unconventional outfits, quote, "He can pull it off, I can't." A small but important concession that turns this from a pure insult into something messier, something closer to a mixture of genuine criticism and grudging respect. And then, almost as a final playful jab, Szafnauer connected Hamilton's fashion sense to his personal life, joking that his style choices may have played a role in his relationship with Kim Kardashian, and that specific comment is exactly what sent this story into overdrive online. Because once clips of this podcast episode started circulating across social media, the reaction was instant and it was massive. Thousands of fans jumped into the comments, some absolutely furious that a former team principal would take shots at Hamilton's personal style rather than focusing on his actual racing career, arguing that Hamilton, at 41 years old, with 7 world championships and more Grand Prix wins than any driver in history, has earned the right to wear whatever he wants, without commentary from anyone, let alone someone who was sitting there in a plain black polo shirt while making the criticism, and that specific detail, the visual irony of a famously understated dresser mocking one of the most stylish athletes on the planet, became a meme in itself within hours. But on the other side of this debate, plenty of fans actually agreed with Szafnauer, at least partially, pointing out that Hamilton's fashion choices have genuinely become a talking point that sometimes overshadows conversations about his on-track performance. And this is exactly where the story stops being purely about clothing and starts connecting to something much bigger. Because this entire controversy is landing at one of the most difficult, most scrutinized stretches of Hamilton's entire career, right in the middle of a Ferrari season that has been defined far more by penalties and points deficits than by pole positions and victory celebrations. And if you have been following Hamilton's 2026 campaign closely, you already know exactly what kind of pressure he has been under, starting at Silverstone, his home race, where he was hit with 2 separate penalties in a single weekend, one for an alleged false start that Ferrari's own sensors could not even confirm, and another for a yellow flag infringement built on a warning light that arrived late on his own dashboard, and then Hungary, where he was penalized again, this time for a pit lane speeding infraction measured at just 0.1 kilometers per hour over the limit, a margin so small that Sky Sports pundit Anthony Davidson, reviewing the footage himself, admitted on air that he genuinely could not explain how a penalty was justified, and Hamilton, clearly exhausted by this run of decisions, told his engineer over team radio, quote, handing out penalties like crazy, and later described the entire weekend in blunt terms as, quote, pretty bad, pretty frustrating. And now, after all of that, after fighting through a season that has left him sitting 50 points behind championship leader Kimi Antonelli heading into the summer break, the biggest headline connected to his name this week has nothing to do with any of it. It is about a podcast comment on his outfit choices, and that timing alone tells you something important about how public perception works in this sport. Because when a driver is winning, when he is dominating headlines with pole positions and victories, jokes about his fashion sense read as harmless, charming, even iconic, part of what makes him a global superstar beyond the cockpit. But when that same driver is fighting through a difficult, penalty-filled championship battle, the exact same comments suddenly land completely differently. They get framed as mockery, as kicking someone while they are already down. And that shift in tone is exactly why this story has generated so much more anger than a similar comment probably would have during one of Hamilton's dominant championship-winning seasons with Mercedes. And it is worth remembering here that Hamilton has never hidden how deeply personal his relationship with fashion actually is. He has spoken publicly, including in major fashion publications, about how his style has always been an act of self-expression, describing how early in his career he was pressured to fit into a much more conservative mold, only allowed to wear suits and official team kit, and how uncomfortable and restricted that made him feel. So for many longtime fans, the idea of a former team principal casually mocking that same self-expression, something Hamilton has described as deeply tied to his own identity and confidence, feels like far more than a lighthearted podcast joke. It feels like a genuine misunderstanding of what his fashion actually represents to him personally. And that is precisely why the reaction online has been split so sharply down the middle, with one side defending Hamilton's right to express himself however he chooses regardless of what critics think, and the other side arguing that Safnauer's comments were ultimately good-natured banter that got blown wildly out of proportion once it hit social media, stripped of the playful tone it clearly had during the actual conversation. And honestly, when you go back and listen to the full podcast exchange rather than just the isolated clip, it does lean more toward lighthearted ribbing than genuine hostility. Safnauer's eventual admission that Hamilton, quote, can pull it off, suggests this was never meant as a serious attack on Hamilton's character. But once a soundbite like this gets extracted, shared, and recontextualized across thousands of social media posts, the original tone and intent almost never survives the journey. And that disconnect between what was actually said in context and how it eventually gets interpreted once it goes viral is really the deeper story hiding underneath all of this outrage. And it raises a genuinely interesting question about modern sports media, because in an era where every single podcast clip, every offhand comment, every joke can be isolated and turned into a headline within hours, how much responsibility do commentators actually carry for choosing their words more carefully, even in casual, off-the-cuff conversations that were never intended to become international news stories? And on the other side of that coin, how much responsibility do fans and media outlets carry for actually engaging with the full context of a comment before deciding to be outraged by it? Because in this specific case, the full podcast conversation reveals a former team boss who ultimately respects Hamilton's confidence and individuality, even if he personally could never pull off the same bold style himself. And that nuance matters, especially at a moment when Hamilton is already under intense pressure from every direction, from stewards, from championship math, from a Ferrari team still trying to find its rhythm, adding a distorted, out-of-context fashion controversy on top of everything else feels like exactly the kind of unnecessary noise that a driver fighting for a championship simply does not need right now. And if you actually look closely at the timing of this story breaking, it lands during one of the most sensitive windows of Hamilton's entire season, right as Formula One enters its mandatory summer shutdown, 2 full weeks where no racing happens, no factories operate, and normally that period gives drivers a genuine mental reset before the second half of the championship begins, a chance to step away from stewards, penalties, and championship math, and instead reconnect with the parts of their public life that have nothing to do with pure competition, fashion, brand partnerships, personal projects, the things that make someone like Hamilton a global figure rather than just another driver on the grid. But instead of that reset happening quietly, Hamilton now finds himself fielding questions, at least indirectly, about a podcast clip mocking exactly that side of his identity, and that timing matters because it shapes the entire tone of how this story gets discussed. Because during a normal, dominant season, a story like this would likely be treated as nothing more than lighthearted paddock gossip, the kind of thing that gets a quick laugh and then disappears within a day or two, but landing during a stretch where Hamilton has already absorbed criticism from multiple directions, questions about his penalty record, questions about Ferrari's strategy calls, questions about whether he can realistically close a 50-point gap to Antonelli. This particular story gets filtered through a much more defensive, protective lens by his fan base, and that is precisely why the online reaction has felt disproportionately intense compared to the actual content of what was said. And it is also worth examining Safnauer's own credibility here for a moment, because this is not simply some random pundit with no connection to the sport. He spent years as a genuine team principal, running both Alpine and Aston Martin at different points in his career, sitting in on countless technical debriefs, strategy meetings, and driver management conversations, which means when he speaks about the paddock, about driver habits, about the culture inside Formula One teams, his opinion carries a certain built-in authority that a typical outside commentator simply would not have. And that authority is exactly why his comments landed with more weight than a random social media post might have. Fans do not just hear a joke, they hear a joke from someone who has actually managed drivers at the highest level of the sport. Someone who has presumably seen firsthand how media attention, sponsor obligations, and personal branding actually function inside a Formula One team. And that context adds an extra layer of legitimacy to his observations, even when wrapped in a playful podcast-style tone. And this raises a fair question worth sitting with. Is there a meaningful difference between a random fan mocking a driver's outfit online and a former team principal, someone who has actually worked inside this sport at the highest level, making the exact same joke on a public podcast? Because the audience, the platform, and the implied authority behind the words are simply not the same. And that distinction is likely a big part of why this story spread so quickly and generated so much genuine debate, rather than fading away as harmless banter, the way it might have if it came from almost anyone else in the media landscape. And there is also a broader pattern worth noting here, because this is not the first time Hamilton's personal choices, away from the actual racing, have become a bigger story than his performance on track throughout his career. Whether it was his music projects, his environmental activism, his fashion ventures, or his outspoken commentary on social issues, Hamilton has consistently existed as a figure who extends far beyond the cockpit, and that visibility, while it has made him one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet, also means he faces a level of public scrutiny that most of his competitors simply never have to deal with. Every choice he makes off the track becomes fair game for commentary, criticism, or celebration. And in some ways, that is simply the price of being the kind of global crossover star that very few Formula One drivers in history have ever managed to become. So here is what we want to know from you, and I mean this honestly. Do you think Otmar Safnauer's comments about Hamilton's clothing were genuinely lighthearted banter that got taken completely out of proportion online? Or do you think there was real, valid criticism buried underneath the jokes? Drop your honest take in the comments below right now, because this debate has genuinely split the fan base, and I want to see exactly where you all stand on it. And if you want to stay ahead of every single Hamilton headline, whether it is on-track drama, penalty controversies, or off-track stories exactly like this one, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications immediately, because we cover every angle of this story before anyone else gets to it. So like this video if you have a strong opinion on this one, share it with any F1 fan who has a take on Hamilton's fashion game, and I will see you in the next one.